Thank you, Stephanie. As Stephanie said, I am Jenny Sweeney with the National Archives. I'm with the National Archives in Fort Worth, Texas. Our main building is in Washington, D.C., but we have buildings all across the country, and I happen to be at our facility in Fort Worth. And today we are going to talk about presidential powers. And we're going to do that by looking at documents, historical documents that we have in our holdings at the National Archives. Now, the National Archives is an independent federal agency, and it is our mission to preserve and provide access to the permanent records of our federal government. And so when you think about the National Archives, you can think about documents that not only let us know about our government and how it works, but also about important events in American history. So today, as I said, we're going to be looking at presidential powers by looking at some historical documents. Now, one of the most important historical documents that we have at the National Archives is obviously the Constitution of the United States. And the Constitution of the United States is where the powers of the president are defined, along with the powers of the other two branches of government, the legislative branch and the judicial branch. Now, the Constitution of the United States is on exhibit at the National Archives building in Washington, D.C., right in between the original Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. Now, millions of people visit the National Archives every year to see these important founding documents of our country. Now, the leader of the executive branch and the United States government is obviously the President of the United States. And our founding fathers defined the powers of the president defined the powers of the president in Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution. And we're going to take a little closer look at that, as well as another area of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 7, that also gives the two powers to the president. So what are those powers of the president? Well, I have a couple of examples here to help us see what those powers are. This is a photograph of President Harry S. Truman, and he is walking along the deck of the USS Missouri battleship, which is also known as the Mighty Mo. And the president here is walking among sailors that were on the USS Missouri. And this photograph represents the fact that one of the main responsibilities or powers of the president is to be commander-in-chief. In the Constitution, it specifically states that the president shall be the commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states when called into actual service of the United States. So with this power of the president is given the power to send our military into harm's way. So this is one of the powers that the president has, and it's given to the president in the Constitution. So another power of the president can be seen by looking at this photograph here. This is a photograph of President George Herbert Walker Bush, and he is standing at the White House on the lawn, and he has there his hand placed on a turkey. And you might be wondering, why would I show you a picture of President Bush with his hand on a turkey? And what does that have to do with presidential powers? Well, the President of the United States actually has the power to grant pardons or commutations. That means, and the wording from the Constitution is that he shall have the power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States. Now, clearly this turkey has not committed a crime, right, against the United States, but this is what would be considered a ceremonial pardon. Every year at Thanksgiving, the President of the United States selects a turkey to pardon, and that turkey lives the remainder of its life out at a farm in nearby Virginia, and that turkey doesn't become Thanksgiving dinner. He has been pardoned officially by the president, and so that is a ceremonial pardon. But in all seriousness, this is one of the powers of the president, the power to either pardon somebody for a crime that they have committed against the United States. If a person is pardoned, then their record is expunged, or basically it goes away. It's as if it had never happened in any way. If a person or if the president chooses to commute a sentence, then that means that the sentence is lessened in severity. So maybe somebody is convicted of a crime and sentenced to death. Well, the sentence could then be commuted or lessened to life in prison rather than being put to death. So that is an example of the power to be able to pardon somebody, or even a turkey, I would say. So another power of the president can be seen through this document here. This is a document that is a signatory page for a treaty with another country. You can see the red wax seals there that were next to the names of the individuals that helped negotiate this treaty. The Americans listed here were John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay. This happens to be the treaty known as the Treaty of Ghent, which was the treaty of peace between Great Britain and the United States to end the War of 1812. This page here is actually attached at the very end of that treaty, and this is the page that President James Madison signed, saying that the treaty had been agreed to and made official. This is an image of the signing of the Treaty of Ghent. It was actually signed on December 24th of 1814. So these diplomats were busy at work even during the holidays, as this treaty was signed on Christmas Eve. And so the power of the president is to negotiate treaties. The individuals that were in Ghent were U.S. diplomats that worked for the State Department, and they were representing President James Madison. And so the president has the power to negotiate treaties. He shall have the power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties, provided that 2/3 of the senators present concur. So if you can remember, when you think about how our government is set up with our 3 different branches of government, our founding fathers wrote into the Constitution the ability for there to be something called checks and balances. This system of checks and balances allowed for each branch of government to check the other branches of government, therefore not making it possible for one branch to become too powerful. Now, in this particular part of the Article 2, Section 2, where it gives the president the power to negotiate treaties, the president can do that on behalf of the United States, negotiate, send diplomats, right, to other countries to negotiate treaties. However, that treaty cannot be made official unless 2/3 of the Senate agree to it and approve it. So in order for the treaty to become official, then the Senate has to approve that. And then afterwards, the president can sign off on it completely and it becomes an official treaty or an official agreement with the other country or countries that we entered into. So this part of the Constitution, even though it gives us the power of the president, it shows that check and balance, right? It shows the ability for the legislative branch, specifically the Senate, to check the power of the president and doesn't allow the president to just go and enter agreements with whichever country he or she sees, wants to have an agreement with. It has to be approved by the Senate. So that is one of the powers of the president. Another power of the president, which also shows that checks and balance, is the ability and power to nominate certain officials. Okay, so it says that he shall nominate and by and with the advice and consent of the Senate shall appoint ambassadors, other public ministers and councils, judges of the Supreme Court, and all other officers of the United States, whose appointments are not herein otherwise provided for. So again, we see in Article 2, Section 2, even though the power to nominate certain officials is given to the president, it's not unless you have that advice and consent of the Senate that that individual is actually approved and can carry on that particular role or position that the president has nominated that individual for. So this is an example of a document of that power of being able to nominate a certain official. It says the White House, August 19th of 1981. It says, to the Senate of the United States, I nominate Sandra Day O'Connor of Arizona to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. And it says, signed Ronald Reagan. And here is a photograph of Sandra Day O'Connor taking her oath of office when she was sworn in as a Supreme Court Justice. President Reagan, when he ran or campaigned to be president of the United States, one of the things that he wanted to do was to be the president to nominate the first female to become a Supreme Court justice. And as you can see through this document, he carried out that promise and did nominate Justice O'Connor. So he was able to do that. One of the other really important powers of the presidency is the ability to sign bills, right, that have been created by the legislative branch of government to sign it into law. Now, this particular power of the president isn't actually defined in Article 2, Section 2 of our Constitution. It's actually defined in Article 1, Section 7. Article 1 is what defines the legislative branch, but we have that check and balance thing in here, okay? And what it says is that in Article 1, Section 7, it says every bill which shall have passed the House of Representatives and the Senate shall, before it become a law, be presented to the President of the United States. If he approve, he shall sign it. So this gives us that check and balance again, right? So it does not, our government is set up so that the Congress or the legislative branch can't just pass laws willy-nilly, whatever they choose to, whatever they want to do. Although that is their main responsibility to pass laws, it's not until that particular bill goes to the president's desk and that president signs it that it actually becomes a law. And so the ability or power for the president to sign a bill into law is one of those checks and balances that the executive branch actually has on the legislative branch. And so this document here actually is the 1965 Voting Rights Act. This was passed in the legislative branch and sent over to President Lyndon Baines Johnson, who chooses to sign. The law itself says to enforce the 15th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. And so when President Johnson signed the law, basically what this law was doing is it was removing all state and local barriers that prevented African Americans from voting in many of the southern states after the Civil War. It prohibited such devices as literacy tests, and what it did is it also empowered the Attorney General to actually be able to enforce the fact that you could not have things or devices like literacy tests to prevent people from being able to vote. So this is a photograph of President Johnson signing the Voting Rights Act into law. So here he is signing this bill into law, and you can see several civil rights leaders, including Martin Luther King Jr., here watching this historic event where this legislation was signed by the President of the United States. So in addition to the president being able to approve bills, to sign them into law and have them become law, the president also has the capability of actually vetoing a law, which means that when a law comes to the president's desk, if the president does not agree with the law, then the president has the capability of vetoing it or rejecting it. And this again is a power of the presidency, which is defined actually in Article 1, Section 7, giving that check and balance again. This is the executive branch checking the legislative branch and its capability of being able to do things. And so it says that if he approve it, he shall sign it. So that is, the part where he was signing it into a bill into law, but then it goes on to say, but if not, he shall return it with his objections to the House in which it shall have originated. So basically what that means is that the President of the United States can, reject a law and choose not to sign it into law. And what happens is that the President can return it to the legislative branch, specifically to the House of Representatives or the Senate, whichever one of those houses actually the bill originates in. If it started in the Senate, it would go back to the Senate. If it started in the House of Representatives, then it would be returned to the House of Representatives. So an example of the veto is this document right here. This was known as the Wagner Bill, and it was a bill that was to establish a national employment system in 1931 under President Herbert Hoover. If you remember, 1929 was the stock market crash, and so the Great Depression had started and was on a roll here, and many people were out of jobs. So this particular bill was supposed to establish a national employment system. But President Hoover chose to veto this bill because his Attorney General and his Secretary of Labor did not think it was a good idea, and so he took their advice. You can see at the bottom, the very bottom of the document, there's a handwritten notation in there, and this this particular document or bill is about 20 some pages long. So I'm just showing you an example of the first page where President Hoover writes in his notation, his suggestion of what he thinks should be changed in this particular bill in order for it to go back to the legislative branch, to the House to the House of Representatives, because that is where this particular bill originated, and to let them know these are the things that need to be changed in order for me to basically decide that I'm going to accept it or sign it into law. So under President Hoover, this law was never actually signed, or this bill was never actually signed into law under President Hoover. And so this is just an example of the president's power to be able to veto or reject legislation that is given to the president by Congress or the legislative branch. Okay, so hopefully through some of these documents here, you've been able to see the 6 different powers of the presidency that are defined in the Constitution. Just an overview quickly of those powers. Defined in Article 2, Section 2 are the powers of the president being commander-in-chief, being solely responsible for our military, the ability to grant pardons or commutations to people that have committed a crime against the United States, the ability to negotiate treaties on behalf of our country. Again, it's the ability to negotiate a treaty, not for it to become official. That, in order for it to become official, the legislative branch, specifically the Senate, has to approve it. The power to nominate certain officials is also a power of the presidency defined in Article 2, Section 2, which allows the president to nominate certain officials in certain positions, such as Supreme Court justices or ambassadors. And again, this is one that is checked by the legislative branch, specifically the Senate, and the Senate has to approve these people in order for them to take those positions. Now, 2 important powers of the president that are defined in Article 1, Section 7 is actually the ability for the president to sign a bill into law or also to veto a law. This is allowing the president to either approve a law or to reject it, right? And this is a check and balance on the legislative branch. The executive branch actually checking the work or the actions of the legislative branch. So that's just an overview of those 6 powers of the presidency. So what I'd like to do now is to have the opportunity to take a look at some other documents that illustrate these powers. And first I'd like to pause for just a second and see if we've had any schools have the opportunity to join us at this point that I can interact with, or if we're just having people watch the live stream and not able to interact right now.
We have people on the live stream and on Facebook Live, so.
Okay, fantastic. Well, hopefully in those classrooms, even though we are not able to communicate, and interact, you guys will be able to do this in your classroom with your teacher. I'm going to highlight some documents here, and what I would like you to do in your classroom is to respond to your teacher on which particular power of the presidency that this document is illustrating. Okay, so let's take a look at the first document, which is this one here. And I think I'm going to switch on over to my document camera and see if I can zoom in, and I will read what it says. There we go, now that it is in focus. It says, "Gentlemen of the Senate, I nominate John Marshall, Secretary of State, to be a Chief Justice of the United States in the place of John Jay, who has declined his appointment. And then it has John Adams written in a very large script, and it says United States, January 20th of 1801. So in this particular document, John Adams is nominating John Marshall, who had been Secretary of State, to take over the position of Chief Justice of the Supreme Court because John Jay had declined the appointment. John Jay had been the Chief Justice, but he had declined the appointment at this point, and now John Marshall is being nominated by President Adams. So obviously this document is illustrating the power of the president to be able to nominate certain officials. And I think this document's really interesting because it's only one sentence long, but it really had a very large impact on our nation's history. When John Marshall comes to the Supreme Court and is Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he serves for multiple decades, and because of John Marshall, he establishes the ability for the court to have judicial review, which really made the judicial branch much stronger than it originally was, and therefore being on an equal level of both the legislative and the executive branches. And so this document that's just one sentence long really had a very large impact on our nation's history, specifically when you're dealing with the courts and things that happened in the court system in the early part of American history. So that is just an example of a document showing the presidential power to be able to nominate certain officials. So let's take a look at another document here. I will put up quickly on the screen. Whoops, I accidentally, there we go. So you can see this nice leather-bound front cover of this document. This document is multiple pages long, but I'm just going to show you a few pages, the very first one and then the last page. So let me switch over to my document camera here and zoom in a little bit so that hopefully you can see it. And it says John F. Kennedy, President of the United States of America. And it says, to all to whom these presents shall come, greeting. Know ye that, there's very fancy language in these types of things. It says, whereas the treaty banning nuclear weapon tests in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater was signed at Moscow on August 5th, 1963 by the respective plenipotentiaries of the United States of America, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and was thereafter open to other states for signature at Washington, London, and Moscow. So this particular document, right, is a treaty and shows the power of the president to be able to enter into a treaty. And so this was the treaty banning nuclear weapon tests in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. And it was originally signed between the three countries of the U.S., the United Kingdom, and the USSR, at the time, now currently Russia. And it says on the last page where President Kennedy signed it, you can see his signature here, and then you can also see the presidential seal. Okay, it says, now, therefore, be it known that I, John F. Kennedy, President of the United States, of America, having seen and considered the said treaty banning nuclear weapon tests in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater, do hereby, in pursuance of the aforesaid advice and consent of the Senate of the United States of America, ratify and confirm the same and every article and clause thereof. So President Kennedy is signing this treaty, right? Because it's his right to negotiate the treaty. Then that checks and balances thing, it has to go to the Senate, and he says it was agreed to by the advice and consent of the Senate, right? And so because the Senate had agreed to it, then he could affix his signature and make this treaty official. So this is an example of, the president's power to negotiate treaties on behalf of the United States. And then this is a photograph of President Kennedy signing ceremoniously in the USSR during this time. And then that was in August of 1963. And then the actual treaty was agreed to by the Senate and then signed by President Kennedy in October of 1963. And he is actually assassinated shortly thereafter in November. So this was one of the last official things that he did as president, was to sign this treaty. And in addition, at the very end where it said that, other countries could come and sign, this particular treaty has been signed by over 100 countries at this point now, agreeing to the fact that they would not use nuclear weapons in our atmosphere, in outer space, or underwater. So trying to keep the world safe. So moving on to another document that is showing another power of the president. This is President George W. Bush, and he here is seen with many members of the Marine Corps who were stationed at Camp Lejeune and going through their training. And this was an example, or just an example of a president and showing their power of being commander-in-chief and being in charge of the military. And when you think about the different powers that the president has, yes, the power to command our military is a great power, because you're sending people into harm's way, and there's the potential of those people, losing their lives. And so it's a very heavy responsibility and power to be the commander-in-chief. So let's take a look at another document, and this particular document, I'm going to read from it. It is a 2-page document here, and basically this document is talking about President Richard Nixon, and the document is written by President Gerald Ford, and it says, "It is believed that a trial of Richard Nixon, if it became necessary, could not fairly begin until a year or more has elapsed. In the meantime, the tranquility to which this nation has been restored by the events of recent weeks could be irreparably lost by the prospects of bringing to trial a former president of the United States. The prospects of such trial will cause prolonged and divisive debate over the propriety of exposing to further punishment and degradation a man who has already paid the unprecedented penalty of relinquishing the highest elective office of the United States. Now, therefore, I, Gerald R. Ford, President of the United States, pursuant to the pardon power conferred upon me by Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, have granted, and by these presents do grant, a full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon for all offenses against the United States, which he, Richard Nixon, has committed or may have committed or taken part in during the period from January 20th, 1969 through August 9th, 1974. And so President Ford here, and he spells it out in this document, right? This is clearly a document illustrating the power to pardon, right? Somebody who has committed a crime against the United States. President Nixon, in the Watergate scandal, was probably going to be put on trial for crimes. And President Ford really felt like it would not do any good to do that and that the country needed to heal. And this was a very, very controversial decision by President Ford to use his power of pardon to be able to basically not make former President Nixon have to go to trial for these potential crimes, right? He felt like, and he even states it in this document, he says, you know, he had to step down from the highest office in the land, and that was really embarrassing and humiliating, and nothing is going to be improved by the fact if he has to go on trial. It will be very long, it will be dragged out, and so therefore, I'm going to use my power that's conferred upon me by the Constitution, Article 2, Section 2, and I'm going to use that. And in that way, our country can move past this situation and we can move on and we can heal. And so that is why President Ford chose to use that power of the presidency so that he could see the country healing and move past that time in our nation's history. So President Ford did that, and that is an example, and a really well-known example, and probably the most famous example of a pardon being issued by a president is Gerald Ford pardoning former President Nixon. So another example of that being that power of the presidency being used. So let's take a look at another document here, and this is a bill, okay? The bill is actually, it says, to amend the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. Let me zoom in so maybe you can see that a little better and not be out of focus. There we go. It looks a little better now. And so basically this bill was signed in 1954, and it was signed by President Dwight D. Eisenhower. There's his signature. He had really bad handwriting. President Eisenhower, well, many people and President Eisenhower, at the time of the Pledge of Allegiance, we did not have the words "under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance. And at the time, we were in the Cold War with the USSR, and people felt like in order to add patriotism to the Pledge of Allegiance, that the words "under God" needed to be implemented into the pledge. And so this is actually when the Pledge of Allegiance, the words were changed to what we know as the Pledge of Allegiance that we say today. And so this bill right here is something that probably affects you every day. This, with Dwight D. Eisenhower signing it into law, is something you guys at school probably say the Pledge of Allegiance to start each morning. And this bill right here is what signed that into law and made that change and put the words "one nation under God" into the Pledge of Allegiance. So this is just an example of a bill being signed into law by a president. One of those powers of the president. So let's take a look then at this next document. Oh, let me zoom out so you can see it a little bit better. And I tried to pick things from a variety of different time periods so you could see things throughout our nation's history and the government working and the power of the presidency at work. So this is an example here. It says, to the House of Representatives, for reasons heretofore stated in my several veto messages to Congress upon the subject of Reconstruction, I return without my approval the joint resolution to carry into effect the several acts providing for the more efficient government of the rebel states and appropriating for such purpose the sum of $1 million. And this was signed by President Andrew Johnson, and this was in July of 1867. So this was right after the Civil War, and one of the things that was on many people's mind in Washington was, how are we going to get these southern states up and running again? We've just had the Civil War, and we need to get these states back up and running. Well, there were several different bills that were sent to the president's desk in order to be signed, known as Reconstruction legislation. And as you see here in this particular letter that President Andrew Johnson sent to the House of Representatives, he's saying, I'm not signing this. I don't agree with it, and I don't think it should happen. So he was vetoing that Reconstruction legislation. Shortly after, there is legislation that does pass allowing for the rebuilding of southern states and to help it along and to get back on track after the Civil War. So that is an example of a veto, one of the powers of the presidency. So hopefully you have had the opportunity to learn a little bit more about those 6 powers of the presidency, right, today by looking at these historical documents that we have at the National Archives building, and ones that are showing different time periods in our nation's history. Now, one thing I want to point out is that in the follow-up activity for this particular program, the activity is to create a job description for the President of the United States. And not only do you list the powers of the president that we talked about today, but you also can find out a couple of other things that you need to have. Oh, I'm moving my camera. I meant to do this. Here we go. Do a few other things that would need to be mentioned in the job description, okay? Such as, what are the qualifications to be the president? And it can be found in Article 2, Section 1. Also, what are some of the other roles and responsibilities of the president? And those can be found in Article 2, Sections 1 and 3. What is the duration? How long is somebody going to hold this position, right? And that is found in Article 2, Section 1. And what is the compensation for the position? And it doesn't list a specific monetary amount, right? But it does give information about the compensation, or how much, or the parameters, right, for being able to have the compensation for the president. So the qualifications, the roles and responsibilities, the duration, and the compensation are all things that can also be found in Article 2, which defines the presidency and the the executive branch and the powers of the president. So I'm sorry that I didn't have an opportunity to interact with any students today, but hopefully you've had an opportunity to see what these different powers of the president are, as well as getting a little bit more information at the very end there, where you can find out other information that relates to the executive branch, specifically the president. So I want to thank everybody for tuning in to this particular program for the Presidential Primary Sources Project, and hopefully you can join me in the future through other distance learning programs that help you learn about our nation's government as well as important events in American history by looking at documents from the National Archives. So thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.